right, thank you everyone. We're going to get started with our first panel now. I just wanted to let you know the second to last page in your packet has the details of who's up here on this panel. They'll introduce themselves, but just so that you have their information in front of you and what each panel is about. This first one is about CARe Insurer Cases and the conversation that you have in the first step when there's possible compensation. And Evan Benjamin is going to be the moderator for this. He is the Senior Vice President for Quality and Population Health and the Chief Quality Officer at Bay State Health in Springfield.
Good afternoon, welcome back. We're actually really excited about this. When we planned the forum, we really wanted to try to think about what are the issues that people are grappling with and how to move all this forward. And this particular panel really came up from your comments about what is it like to have these conversations, and particularly at different phases. And so we're going to talk about the different phases of conversations with patients, and I have an incredible expert panel to help us along. Our goal, though, is really to have you guys asking the questions. I'm going to start things off with about 5 or 6 questions to get the ball rolling, and I want you guys to be thinking about some questions as we get going. So first, just a guide as we think about this. And I mentioned this for those of you here earlier in the morning. We talk about when we make a referral to the insurer. And primarily this is done when we are evaluating a case. We've done an internal investigation. We've done a root cause analysis. And in that investigation, we've determined that the standard of care we believe has been violated, or if we're unsure, or it has been violated. And we believe that that violation in the standard of care has caused harm. Those are, very clear criteria. And there was a question from Rick Boothman of, well, how do you handle it when it's not that clear? And we'll talk about that. But when it's a clear meeting the insurer criteria, it's because we have moved on those 2 questions. We then have a conversation with the patients again. So we've already had some early conversations. There's been an apology. There's been some communication of what the facts were. And then we're having another conversation. And that's really where this comes in. So if you look in the packet and on our resources, you'll see this conversation is really fitting in after there's already been an initial disclosure and after we've had conversations with the patients and we're tracking that conversation. We've done an investigation. And now we're really here in the middle of a first conversation where we're beginning the process to talk about resolution. Okay, so just so where all this fits. We thought we would just try to set this up for you, and I just want to, we have a brief video, but let me just set the stage for this video. So we have a patient, Mrs. Moore, who was admitted to the hospital for an appendectomy, and while she was there, she actually got Zofran. She received the drug, and she had a cardiac arrest. The co-team was actually delayed in arriving, and she had some very significant complications as a result of this event. The hospital doesn't believe it met its standard of care. When they gave the medication, it was really without proper processes to check for allergies, and that became clear in the root cause analysis. So this is now the point where there's already been an initial discussion with the patient and the family. It's been disclosed that the processes look like we violated a standard of care. And now it's been passed on, it's been an insurer case, and there's just a short clip of what this conversation could look like. Yeah, let me get volume here.
Thank you, Doctor. And thank you again, Mrs. Moore, for being with us. I know this has been a very difficult time for you, recovering not only from this appendectomy, but also from this event. And again, we are truly sorry for that. I'd like to talk to you a little bit now about how we might be able to be more helpful to you. As you know, we have waived all the bills for your care here because we really do not feel proud of the care that we've delivered. But we also want to see if there's anything else that we might be able to do for you. And one of the things that we often do is send your records to an outside entity, our medical malpractice insurer, so that they can take a look at that, have some experts review it outside of our facility, make sure that they've seen everything, that we haven't missed anything, and make sure there's nothing else that we might be able to do for you. Does that sound like something that you'd be interested in?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has really impacted my life, and I think it's only fair for someone else to take a look and make sure that you've seen everything.
Of course, and that's why we do this. So in order for them to take a look at those records, you would need to just sign a consent which would release them to release those records to them. And the reason for that is because they're outside of our organization, and that's your protected private health information. So really, we at the hospital are the only ones who have permission to look at it. So you need to sign that form. We know that you have seen and heard a lot today from the doctors and from some of our patient safety staff. So you are welcome to take this home, take a look at it, show it to your family, and talk it over with them and anyone else we would like to. But we are going to be having a number of conversations over the next few weeks, so don't feel any pressure to decide this today. But if you have any questions about this,
I think, I'll probably take this to my attorney, just to make sure that I'm not signing my rights away to everything.
Yes, of course. You can consult an attorney, and if you'd like them to be involved in this process with you, that's completely fine. I do want to reassure you that this is really only so that the medical malpractice insurer can see your medical records. There's not signing away any rights, but you can, of course, bring this to your attorney or whoever else you like, and that would be completely fine. If you do decide to go this route, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what the process will be like. So I will set you up with one of the insurance claims reps. You'll have a conversation with them about sort of the timeline, when they'll send it out to experts, when you can expect to hear back, and those kinds of things. But that doesn't mean that our relationship has ended. If you have any questions for me or the doctors or any other things that you've been thinking about, please feel free to call me. Our relationship is continuing. As I said, I'll be in touch with you over the next several weeks.
That's good to know.
Okay, good. I'm really, again, want to say I'm sorry on behalf of the institution, and I'm really hoping that this meeting has been helpful for you to hear from the doctors and hear about some of our patient safety improvements. And I really, again, thank you for taking the time to come in today.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for taking my concerns so seriously.
So, thank you. We have our Academy Award-winning actors, Melinda. These are obviously very challenging conversations, and where they happen in an organization tends to be a little bit fluid. We try to keep a consistency in terms of who's having the conversation, but you'll see here what we've gathered is a group of folks who are representing a patient safety department, a patient relations department, and a claims folks on the insurer side. And it's really those three that those departments really need to work really closely together as we have these conversations. So let me just introduce, first of all, Cheryl Tott, who's the interim director of patient safety at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. Deb Barbuto, who's a patient relations specialist at BI Deaconess Medical Center. Elaine Collins, who's a claims manager at CRICO, the Risk Management Foundation. Diane Thomas, a patient relations specialist at Bay State Medical Center. And Jennifer Heileman, who's a claims manager at Bay State Health. So what we want to do is just talk about these particular conversations. And I want to start with Cheryl. And start with just, when we try to prepare for these conversations, how do we prepare our staff? What are we saying as we're going into these conversations?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Evan. These conversations are incredibly important, not only to our patients, but certainly to our staff. And the way we think about them is to really sort of recognize what I would think of as our three shared goals in thinking about these conversations. That's care and support for the patient, care and support for the provider, and really ongoing communication amongst those people. So when we think about preparing for the initial conversation, we're going to involve our patient safety coordinator, who essentially is going to be available for discussion and coaching around that initial conversation, because we really want that, you know, to go well for the patient and the family. We want there to be an apology, an expression of empathy for an event having happened. And a number of people earlier today have talked about that initial conversation to provide information that we know at this early juncture in the investigation, that we know and not what we surmise, because it really is human nature to sort of want to say this might have happened because of this, and we want to you know, guide our providers to you know, to not have that kind of conversation very initially. And also at that early juncture, we're wanting to involve our patient relations representative, hopefully for them to be part of that initial conversation, because that really establishes them as the point of contact for the patient and the family as we go through the process. So that's what we think about for our initial conversation. And I think some of the other guidance that we give and I give is to be a good listener. You want to be a good listener because something unintended has happened to a patient, so we want to make sure that we're hearing from them. Concurrently, we're obviously undergoing, you know, our own internal investigation. And also at this early juncture, it's usual that we would give our insurer, CARE, a heads up to say we have an unintended you know, event that has happened. We essentially want to notify you. So in doing that at that early phase, they have sort of the name of the patient. They have, you know, information that we know regarding the event. They have the patient safety coordinator contact, and they have the patient relations contact. So early on, they have that information. I will make one statement about Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and which is a little bit unique about us. Patient safety coordinator and the risk manager are the same person. So that person has will shepherd this case from sort of start to finish. So that's fairly unique. And also we are patient relations and patient safety coordinator and risks are within the same department, and we are also in incredibly close physical proximity to one another. So that makes engaging in sort of planning for these kind of conversations a little bit easier. So that's just a little bit of something that's unique about us. When we think about a conversation, the follow-up conversation after we've concluded our internal investigation and we've determined that there are opportunities and that we've deviated from our internal standard of care, we would want to share that with the patient. We want to be you know, able to provide that information to the patient. We want to be able to provide them factually with what we've discovered, as well as what we've done to prevent it, hopefully, from happening, what we've done immediately, and what we plan to do in the future. So it's really engaging both the patient representatives and the patient safety coordinator, as well as the providers involved in sort of planning for that discussion, because certainly, you know, apologizing for that, providing that information, making sure that we're listening to the patient and the family about the impact that this has had on them. We want to make sure that they don't have any questions. We want to give them an opportunity to ask questions of us, to be sure that they are comfortable. And then thinking about sort of engaging in our CARE Insurer process. And that would really, and Deborah will speak a little bit more in detail to that process, but in planning for that, we would essentially have a conversation about the components that we want to be sure that we're providing to the patient and family. And that's that we would like very much to, you know, undertake with our insurer, you know, further review, and how we do that is, you know, securing permission from you to look at the record. So all those pieces we sort of march through in preparation for those conversations. But I think really the takeaway that I think about in preparing our staff to have these conversations is to think about those shared goals, and that's really, care and support for the patient, care and support for the providers, as well as maintaining the lines of communication all the way through the process. So it's been a remarkably rewarding journey for us. So
thank you. So you sort of teed up, my next question was, let's focus in on the perspective of the patient relations specialist. So Diane and Deb, maybe Diane, you could maybe address, when we think about these conversations, what are the most difficult parts of these conversations? And what are you concerned about? What are as you're anticipating that? And then maybe Deb, just to think about a follow-up. So what have you found that has helped to make these conversations more comfortable?
One of the most difficult parts of this conversations really start in the beginning with recognizing where the family is, where the patient is in this event, and recognizing that they may be emotionally devastated, and taking some time out to really be upfront about that. And even in the preparation stage, when you're talking to providers before these conversations happen, reminding them of that, because it's really important to help steer that conversation at the place where the family's at. Otherwise, the provider could go off into a technical journey when the family is really, their real issues are, what about tomorrow? What about school? What about work? What about the prognosis? And so our role as patient relations folks is really to help ground and keep that conversation centered with where the patient and family are right here. So it's really thinking about their emotions, the family's emotions, the patient's emotions, but also in the prep work, having the provider work through their emotions so that they don't go into the meeting and go into that discussion with a lot of defensiveness, but really understanding that this is a clinical conversation, at least the prep part. It's a medical clinical conversation, which is not foreign to you, but it feels foreign because the family may be coming with a support team, and we encourage that. And that support team may include their attorney and really helping the provider. So a lot of that is difficult. The other difficult piece is just not knowing what to expect, just knowing that it will be different every single case, every single time. But once you're open to the fact that it is just an unknown journey, and you step into it that way, the process just becomes much easier. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, I think that's been my experience. I think reestablishing that trust with the patient or the family member that you're in conversations with about this adverse event is one of the most challenging and difficult components of the conversation or that initial outreach phone call. I think one of the most important things, though, is the prep that you do prior to that initial phone call in working with your team members, like especially working very closely with the patient, safety coordinator or a risk manager for some of you.
I would just add, too, that sometimes the challenge is around that trust factor because, after an event has occurred, it is really important to recognize that the family and the patient are not at a place where they may trust the organization, may trust your role, or may understand your role. So it's an opportunity to engage in a dialogue to understand why you're there to help support and advocate for them and be transparent in that process.
So let's talk to our claims managers, who are obviously, we moved down the field a little bit. And maybe Elaine, you want to talk a little bit about as a claims person, when we have these conversations, how do they help you in your work as you're managing these claims?
Well, we come in, obviously we learn early on about these scenarios as Cheryl described, but we come in at a later time, and hopefully if it does go well, with a calmer, more open patient or family. And the key is, I have some kind of bullet points, that when they come in, that they are not obviously happier, but they're much more content to work with us. Because as Cheryl mentioned, we need to get HIPAA forms and we have to get them signed. And oftentimes, one of the things that we find that delays this process is their reticence, as the video showed, that they think they're signing off their rights or something that they don't quite understand. And so when they're more content, they can hear what we're looking for, that we're an outside investigator. We're looking to kind of find out the details separate from what the hospital is doing, because what we're viewing is standard of care in medical malpractice, which is the reasonable treating healthcare provider. And so we talk to them about getting the medical records, and then if they are happy, as you mentioned, or they're more content, or had a good first impression, then they are more open to hear about our process. And that's very important, because our process may take a little bit of time, because we do have to gather all the medical records. We do have to have it reviewed by outside, unbiased experts that have no connection with that hospital and no connection with that particular healthcare provider. And if there's multiple healthcare providers, that takes some time. So again, when we've got patients that are there and listening, they appreciate it, they understand, because I think a timeline's a big thing. They think that they're going to have an answer immediately. They don't understand. Oftentimes it may take a year, that what is going into play, that we're not delaying, but there's a lot. We want to be thorough on their behalf. We want to let them know that we're really looking into these details and gathering facts. Another thing, when we receive patients that had a good first initial conversation, is that they understand that we're working in concert with the hospital, that we are partners, and that we're really trying to get an answer for them, that we are on their side in the sense that we are getting the facts, we're getting the details, and we're working with them. And our claim reps are very experienced at having a constant communication, and so they'll give updates, give explanations, tell them where we are in the process. Another thing is that we give the patients an opportunity to ask us questions. They feel, and so there's a development of trust between the insurance carrier. Oftentimes patients think of insurance and they think we're these cold, hard businesses, but not in this scenario by any means. And so that trust develops, and we'll listen to them, they'll listen to us, and we can work through this process and work through it cohesively, so we can figure out standard of care. If there was any issue with standard of care, is there causation that possible breach caused the damages, and what the damages are? And those are the different areas that are explained to the patient. And again, they're more open, willing to listen to those. When we've got a very good process, which I say happens quite often, and more often than not with BI. And I guess that's really it. It's a very cohesive, close relationship that we have with BI.
Thank you. And Jennifer, also from your perspective as a claims manager, maybe you can give some examples of when these conversations have gone well. What are some of the best situations that have resulted from these positive conversations?
Sure. And I would just echo what's been said already from Elaine and Diane and everyone else, that if the conversation goes well initially with patient relations and our patient safety folks, it makes for a smoother transition to the insurer side. It's the beginning of building some trust with the patient and their family and their advocate, and so that when it comes over to our side, the insurer side, they've already started that process. And it's very helpful if a patient comes in and feels that they've already been heard. Not only do they want to get their clinical information, but they want a chance to express what their emotions are, as Diane said and Deborah said. They want an opportunity to be able to sit down and explain how that's impacted them and their family, and how that, and to actually feel that they've been heard. When those conversations go well, it makes it, as I said, a smoother transition, and it can result in a better outcome. An example that comes to mind was a very sad situation where a mom lost her baby at delivery. And it was a situation where we investigated it internally, and we felt that we hadn't done our best, that we should have really considered delivering the baby by C-section sooner than we did. We reached out to the patient. We encouraged her to bring an attorney with her. She came in with her, the baby's father and her attorney, and we sat down with the obstetrician and a maternal fetal medicine specialist, and and Diane, and had a conversation with the patient. The insurer isn't involved in that conversation. One thing, it took a little time for the mom to actually get to the point where she even wanted to come in and discuss what had happened to her. And we have to be respectful of patients' timelines, what works for them, where they are at in their grieving process. And we try to be very respectful and treat every case differently based upon what the patient's needs are. In that particular case, the mom came in, and the one thing we learned from her at that meeting was that she was carrying a tremendous amount of guilt over the death of her baby. She felt that she was to blame, because initially a cesarean section had been recommended for her, and she had declined the cesarean section. And so this entire time, and we didn't really even appreciate it until the meeting took place, this mom felt that she was to blame for the baby's death. She was reassured by the clinicians that it was not her fault. She was not to blame. And the clinicians took responsibility for the decisions that had been made and the information that had been conveyed to that patient. She left that meeting feeling, I was told afterward, that a tremendous amount of guilt had been lifted from her shoulders. When I spoke to her attorney, I reached out to her attorney after that. Diane had given him my contact information. I reached out and said I'm ready and willing to discuss the compensation part of this conversation whenever he is. And he said again at that time, the mom just isn't ready yet. She's in counseling, she needs some time. And I said, that's fine, whenever she's ready, let me know, please. We had a few more conversations, and the case was resolved in a prompt and fair manner. But the thing that the attorney reinforced that the mother felt was so grateful for the conversation that had taken place, that aside from compensation, what really meant the most to her was really that she understood she wasn't to blame. And that he said, I remember him saying to me, that's the way that these should all be handled. This type of a situation where a patient has an unexpected outcome, and if they are feeling some guilt, that there's a fair or an open communication. So that was an example that certainly comes to the forefront of my mind when I think about a good example of how a case has gone through smoothly and resolution was achieved after a very helpful conversation, an initial conversation.
Thank you. I think we talked this morning a little bit about when organizations are doing a CRP, this idea of selective CRP versus a true universal CRP. And I think that's just a great example of, if organizations are waiting for that pre-litigation notice, we never would have heard it from this patient. And she would have gone on through her entire life feeling the blame for this event when we knew that we didn't manage this patient into a standard of care.
Right.
And by having a philosophy which is consistent, which is we communicate and apologize and talk, we realized what was going on. I mean, I think it's a really profound story about why you have to stick to your principles and focus universally, regardless of what you think the patient knows or what they don't know.
And if I can just add one more element to that story, and we actually went out and met with the providers, and there were a number of providers who were involved in that particular situation, and they were as devastated as the mother was by the outcome, and they needed support as well. So it was really kind of the full circle of reaching out to everyone involved in that case.
I'm going to ask one more question, so I want you guys to be thinking of some questions here. This is the participatory part of our afternoon. But these are the experts. I mean, these are the folks who are really out there on the front lines dealing with patient safety and claims and patient relations, and who have been doing this successfully now for 5 years. But a question which is asked to me often is, how is this different when you have an organization that has a small self-insured captive like Bay State Health, where you may have a sort of tighter relationship between Jen and claims and patient relations and patient safety, versus when you're just dealing with CRICO, which is something in between, very large organization, but external to BID, versus an organization which is commercially insured, and they're dealing with Coveris. And we've had, Coveris is part of our alliance as well. What are the differences between the two? So I'm going to address this to Jennifer and Elaine.
So I guess the difference is that we're outside, and we don't really participate at all in any of the internal meetings. We learn about it very early. We're very cohesive with the risk management department, and so they keep us up to date on what's going on. but we operate separately, and I think this is a similarity in this sense because our jobs are very different. We're looking at things from an objective, outside expert evaluation on a standard of care of your average treating, whereas I think oftentimes the internal evaluation is more the standard that they're looking in the expectations of that particular entity or institution. So the real difference is probably more geographical than anything else, that we are in a different location, but again, our relationship, our discussions, I even have spoken to Deborah in the patient advocacy department. So I think that's key to making this process work. And so I think we're pretty close other than geographically.
Right. It sounds like we are. And actually our claims managers sit we're in the same department as the risk management department. So we interact with risk managers and the director of risk every single day. We hear about situations that are going on in the hospital or hospitals or medical practices early on. We know about adverse events that happen, almost from the time that they do happen, and we get involved, or at least we learn about the early investigation of situations involving adverse events. We work very closely with the risk managers in our department. We have the same overall philosophy about the CARE program, and it sounds like CRICO does as well. I'm not sure if that's true of outside insurers. I just not having the experience there, but I know that it is true when the claims folks are part of the hospital itself, the health insurance system.
Thank you. So, come down to the microphones. Please use the microphone so people can hear, and love to have your questions.
Hello, I'm Joanne Locke from Brigham and Women's Faulkner Hospital. It's been a really nice panel. Thank you. In a former life, I was a plaintiff's malpractice attorney, and now I work in hospital risk management. And the area that I am most perplexed about is not the wrong site surgery or something that's quite obvious, but something where the hospital during the first conversation feels that the standard of care has not been met. But when it goes to an outside reviewer, they feel the standard of care has been met. And I think we all know that sometimes the issue of standard of care is very nuanced and requires a level of expertise that you wouldn't have access to during the first conversation with the patient. And I wondered, has that situation come up for any of you? And if so, how do you manage that both with the patient and in collaboration with each other?
Great question.
Well, that is a great question, and those are the types of cases that you deal with on a daily basis. Things that aren't black and white necessarily, but are kind of shades of gray. So that, internally there might be a thought that perhaps we didn't provide our best care, but I think that our at least my understanding is that these initial meetings, there's not, the conversation may indicate that we don't feel that we provided our best care, but we're going to, if you'd like, with your permission, we'll send it to our insurer and we'll have some outside objective experts take a look at this. And if that information comes in and it's different than what the internal investigation is, we share that information with the patient, their family, and their attorneys as well. And that really, I think, in the long run, and every case is different, every case is fact specific, and sometimes there's multiple physicians or providers involved with different specialties. We have to look at the whole case, and we have to consider, what the outside experts say in addition to what the internal review was, and make a decision whether or not compensation would be provided. But we try to be clear and transparent about it and explain the basis for our decision.
And if I could add, I think it's important that we are the insurance carrier for our institutions, and so we owe our insureds the duty to make sure we look at the care, look at it thoroughly, and do it for both sides. And the key being that a particular institution's root cause analysis or evaluation, again, is their standard, but when we're talking about med-mal, that's the average treating. And so we make sure and explain to our patients or plaintiffs or whomever that we're getting someone unbiased, we're getting someone in that particular field. It may be like Jennifer said, multiple healthcare providers, and we are having them evaluate the case, because the standard is the prospective, not retrospective, and you've got to put yourself in the place of that healthcare provider. And that's kind of difficult when you already know the results. And so oftentimes we'll get a blind case, give our outside expert medical records and say, Tell us what you think happened without giving them the results. So we're truly looking at the care. Granted, medical treatment, unfortunately, sometimes and most time in these scenarios, they get a result that they don't want. But that again doesn't mean deviation from the standard of care. But that, like Jennifer said, we're very transparent and we try to give all those details and explain it. And that's why when we get a good patient who comes in and who's had a great first entree into this, kind of understands and can hear that process, and we try to keep them continually aware of how we're proceeding. Is that answering it? I hope.
You know, I would echo that as well, regardless of, you know, sort of the outcome for the patient. These kind of ongoing conversations are so critically important and really, I think have been so helpful to patients. So I would echo that ongoing communication is really critical.
I think also just the initial conversation of the very first conversation really sets up the expectations and the follow-up conversations here. And as you heard Melinda on the video, she's setting up the next step as well. And so they all sort of, you know, piggyback on one another around transparency and honesty so we can move forward.
Hi, Patricia Falco speaking on behalf of the Obstetricians of Massachusetts. I'm the state member at large from Massachusetts section of the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. I have on my wish list many things I wish would be done. I wish that there could be a way that patients don't have to have an adverse outcome in order to have someone be able easily and easy access to explain what care they received and why. We certainly do not have time in physician schedules of active care for that to be reimbursed. Next, I would greatly appreciate if there's a way to communicate with clinicians as soon as there is something coming from a patient side in any way, and to include them all along the way in everything. Because the question that you asked exactly, even when a bunch of experts get together and they go, WTF happened here, you know, that is all way too common because often that is hushed up or not covered in a department. There isn't real-time feedback with that department's patient care assessment committee. There isn't any real-time look at what are system issues. There isn't any real-time readjustment of what's going on within the department. And there isn't any kind of real-time follow-up for, oh my, what else happened here? Often people are placed in these tiny silos, told to shut up entirely, and I wish that there would be a way to communicate with patients who go, well, I'm going to sue because I want to find out what happened. Excuse me, but that's the last place you're going to find out what happened. You're going to get everybody's CYA answer to my best excuse, this is it. But you are not going to find out what happened. Thank you.
I'd just like to address that a little bit because I think our role as patient relations experts facilitates those discussions with patients, and that's something that we embrace and we step into it. And so when the patient or family contacts us and says, and it's not an unusual conversation, well, they will say, this is what I think happened and I'm going to get an attorney, then our role is to say, let's talk about that. Bring in whoever you'd like to bring in to be part of this conversation. And the dialogue is ongoing, so it's not just a one and done sort of situation, but it's an ongoing dialogue. And we always end each conversation by saying, today we've given you a lot of information to process. And so we want you to go home and think about what you've heard, jot down additional questions, call us when you're ready to come back for more. And, you know, and a lot of times they come back for more. A lot of times, often though, they may go home and it may be the end of it and they're processing it and they're like, now I'm starting to understand. So it's a work in progress. It's not just a one and done.
And if I may add just briefly, as I think the previous presenters made a comment in the data that they gathered, oftentimes this process does answer those questions. And so it does result in no suit or no claim. They now have the answers. And so they're somewhat, you know, satisfied and comfortable because they I think that's the problem that generates claims and suits, is the fear of the unknown, the anger of something bad happened. And so that's what's so beautiful about this process.
But
Go ahead.
I think from my experience, though, we do invite patients to come in, even if it's something that's not headed for a claim or it's a MACRMI case. We'll have patients come in and meet with somebody who actually, clinician that reviewed the care that was provided, and sit down and speak with them and answer their questions. So this is not something necessarily that's going to be a lawsuit or anything of that nature. We give patients the opportunity to come in after a care has been reviewed. It may be not necessarily an adverse event, but there are questions on whether we could have done something better or have a better system in place to prevent this from happening again. But not necessarily an adverse event per se.
You know, I think oftentimes I can sort of hear us saying, you know, I think this patient or this family would benefit from a conversation, because we're getting the sense, patient relations is getting the sense that they're not quite understanding sort of parts of their care, and it's oftentimes that we'll bring them in to really have a conversation. I think for all of us, we always strive to be better communicators, you know, physicians as well as everyone else caring for patients. So I think oftentimes we do that.
Paula Griswold with the Massachusetts Coalition for the Prevention of Medical Errors. I have a question for the insurers. I realize you've expanded already a bit on how you talk with patients and families, but I'm curious, are there people who've come in who simply are not believing that you are unbiased and independent? And how do you approach the conversation if people are coming in mistrustful from the start?
I would say because you've got unhappy patients or unhappy families, they've lost someone, oftentimes they're very, very angry. And what the claim rep will do, oftentimes, again, that's been teed up by patient advocacy and risk management, is an explanation of, we're going to get unbiased experts, we're going to look and see what happened. I mean, I'll tell you that oftentimes, and I've seen it in both litigation, claims, in both processes, where we have experts look at it, because humans are complex, medicine's complex, and so we have experts evaluate it, and then we can come in and explain, these are the answers. So we try to set that up front. We're going to try to get answers for you. It doesn't mean that there's a deviation from the standard of care or there's causation, but it means that we're going to try to get answers, and we hope to do that. And oftentimes they say, sorry, I'm going to get an attorney, and we say, absolutely, and when you do, please give the attorney our name and number. We want to work with you.
I guess I was interested in that too. Do you find it's helpful to basically encourage the individual to have an attorney so that they
if they don't understand it? You know, we have a lot of people that English is not their first language. And so we've gotten translators involved. We recommend attorneys. I know MACRMI has a list of recommended attorneys. We don't recommend anyone. We just say there's many great attorneys out there, and if that's what you want, absolutely, and here's our number, please have them give us a call.
And I would agree with that. And sometimes it's very helpful, to be honest with you, if the patient does have an attorney involved, because the attorney typically would have a sense, you know, would be experienced in medical malpractice and familiar with care, and at least understands what the process is and what the insurer is actually taking a look at, is familiar with the fact that we would be getting outside external experts who are objective to review the case, and also can, I think, help communicate with the patient if they are feeling distrustful of the claims folks, you know, about expectations, and help to convey the information, and to help to set some reasonable expectations if compensation is offered.
Thanks.
Hi, yeah, my name is Kim Winter, and I am in the unusual position of being both a plaintiff's attorney some of the time. I'm a provider's attorney some of the time, but I'm also a provider level person. I have professional licenses myself. My question really does have to do partly with the claims process, because I will tell you that I'm on the MACRMI list, and I've had several experiences with clients going through this process. And one of the things I think happens is that on the institutional level, I have the sense that they've done their root cause analysis. They talk to the patients, and they say something along the lines of, we'd like to make amends. When it goes to the insurance level, I feel like the first thing that they're thinking of is, we'd like to defend. and I'm being very honest about this here. And one of the things that I think is a real challenge for you is to think about when you're talking about standard of care, the average qualified person. Well, I will have to tell you, absent, situations where there are clear protocols, no one really knows what the average qualified person will do. They know what they would do. They might know what their colleagues will do. But that's a very challenging thing. And I guess what I see sometimes is the provider saying, we are certain that this was an error. They're really saying that. And then the insurer finds a person with what I would say is a different opinion. And I think that really needs to be carefully weighed. Because I think it's a real challenge for you guys. And I'm not saying, I understand you're doing your job. I'm not saying you're doing the wrong thing. But I think that the validity of that different opinion really needs to be weighed. And I will tell you just very quickly on a provider level, I was involved in a situation where there's unquestionably a clear error made. And we reported it as such. And told the patients about that. And the insurer came up with someone, somehow, that had a different opinion about how that should have gone. And if I told you what it was, you'd immediately say, oh my gosh, but that's what happened. And I, as a provider, was extraordinarily disappointed by that. And I guess I really would like you to think through the process and say, is what we're getting really objective, or we're just getting, a second opinion on this? And that's my call.
Well, I'd like to come in on that and just to point out that
Claims, folks.
all I can do is talk about what CRICO does, and my guess is Bay State's very similar. We always look for unbiased experts. We want to find an expert that's in that particular field. Oftentimes in our institutions, we have very specialized healthcare providers, so we have to go all over looking for it. We have the luxury of being in Boston, where there's some amazing healthcare providers, but the key always is to have unbiased evaluations. We don't retain experts to get the answer. We're not a result-oriented group. We get experts and provide the medical records, because we're not experts, and have that expert give us their opinion. And if their opinion, again, we've got to rely upon their opinion. The one thing we do point out, though, is we want a prospective evaluation, not a retrospective. And I will tell you, oftentimes when you have the result already, it's hard not to look at this, because you're empathetic and sympathetic and sad about the outcome. But I'll tell you, the one thing we do is really important, is to try to have a blind evaluation, to have that expert look at it. So we don't get paid experts. We don't retain people that are biased. We really pride ourselves on having people that are fair, have no connections with our healthcare providers, but really look at the case prospectively to put themselves in the position of that healthcare provider, so we have a fair evaluation.
I would echo that. And in addition to that, I would say that if we have differing opinions, maybe the provider felt that he or she did something wrong, we go outside to an external expert, and they say they think that the care met the standard of care, we'll get another opinion from another objective expert. So we're not out there, at least I'm certainly not at Bay State and not at CRICO, we're not out there looking for a hired gun to come and give us an opinion that we want to hear. We go to treating physicians who are board certified in the specialty of that provider, oftentimes a second physician within that field as well, and oftentimes multiple fields of medicine, not only standard of care, but causation issues. And that oftentimes requires 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 experts in a case.
These are tough cases, and I just will comment that, in the years that we've been doing this, the cases where we believe there was a big discrepancy between our internal investigation and then an expert witness when it becomes an insurer case are very small. And I would hate to see, this exception and the challenges of what we're doing in this journey, derail this dramatic, fundamental change in how we think about communicating and apologizing and moving to resolution, which has been so positive. So yes, there are challenges, but I would say these are small cases, but we have to grapple with. Dr. Pita.
very quick question. Based on the video that Melinda did and for the MACRMI leaders, is it now standard policy from the MACRMI folks to suggest that you have an industrial supersized box of Kleenex as part of the disclosure conversation?
Melinda?
Yes.
That's pretty good.
That's a good observation. It was a big box.
I didn't notice it either. You're very observant.
Thank you, Randy. Please.
Ihor Belik, I have two questions. One is with regard to shared decision making. As everyone knows, now we have patients participating in what they want to have done and not done. I think Jennifer's case kind of alludes to it a little bit, where the mother decided, the physicians gave them her choice to do a C-section. She decided not to. I don't know all the details of that case, but it sounded to me that maybe she was guilty because she said no, even though the physician said that this is the right thing to do. And so they had this shared decision-making in a way where the physician may have not have been as adamant because he thought, well, maybe it's okay if we don't do it right now, but maybe we can wait later. And it turned out there was an adverse event for whatever reason. So my question is, how much does the physician, in terms of assessing the fault or whatever, or what can a physician do? And there's a lot of shared decision making, and if it turns out that the patient wants to do something that, you can't really take their rights away, say, no, this is what I think is best for you. You know what I mean?
I think what's important in that situation is to make sure that the patient is informed of the consequences of their decision. In our particular case, we didn't feel, after our analysis, that she had been appropriately informed of the risks of declining a C-section. So it's important for a clinician in that position to explain the risks of the decision that the patient is making and to document it in the medical record.
If they did do that and the patient still insists not having procedure done that the physician requests, then would that absolve the physician somewhat, or?
It's a case-by-case basis. It would have to be, what the procedure was that was declined, what the information was that was conveyed to the patient. Did the patient completely understand the risks?
So gray zone, right.
It's a gray zone. It's a case-by-case basis, but I would encourage physicians to inform their patients and to document it.
And my second question is with regard to, it's a little bit unusual kind of situation where one can have an adverse event that occurs, and then the patient loves their physician very much. They do not want to sue them so they'd have a bad mark or whatever, but yet they need the money to be able to get follow-up, potentially expensive care for this. Is there anything that patient can do besides, suing or not, to get the money that they need without, so they can continue to have good relations with his physician?
I'm not a legal expert, but I will take that question because I've seen that where there's been a patient who's approached us and has felt really strongly that, in this case, so sometimes for the patient it's a measure of control, and in this particular case, the patient had a very trusting relationship with the provider, did have a bad outcome, didn't want to, and the patient deliberately chose, I don't want to talk to my provider about my bad outcome because when I look at that provider in his face, I still want to establish that trust. So for him, his choice was to have the dialogue with the patient relations office and have that dialogue that would normally be with the provider. That's the way that he wanted it. And we talked and we worked through that process. But concurrent with that process is letting him know that our claims folks are working on the claims end of what he's looking for and that we're all working towards the same outcome. So sometimes that's where involvement, especially of your patient relations folks, really can help facilitate that process and keep that dialogue going.
So we're talking about like compensating the patient without actually suing or, like the physician, which they want to continue to get care from.
That's what CARE is.
That's what CARE is.
That's exactly what this is. It's figuring out these events, trying to make them right, and particularly if we know that there's a compensable event and something went wrong, that's exactly the process that we're encouraging.
No, I understand, but what I'm saying is where it's very clear the physician did something that was an error and they're at fault, but yet the patient doesn't want to sue them or they need to get the money somehow for their continued care without actually causing a rift in their relationship with their physician and causing them to, do you know what I mean? Like,
so if in the process the allocation of blame was clearly on the physician,
right?
We would still move to a resolution, a compensation. Depending on the evaluation, we could still attribute it to the physician. It wouldn't be a lawsuit, but it would be it would be listed as a settlement, and it would be reported if, in fact. And we talked earlier, that the vast majority of our cases, though, really are attributable to system issues. Over 90% are not attributed to the physician because how complex our medical system is. When we do the analysis, it's often multiple factors. So that's certainly in favor, but the attribution still will be created in any situation.
Okay.
We'll take one more question.
I just wanted to clarify what we all mean when we talk about shared decision making. I've so often heard providers talk about it as if one has to give all the information to the patient and let the patient take the responsibility for the decision. And from the patient's point of view, that's abdicating the clinician's responsibility. When I engage in shared decision making with my provider, I don't have the knowledge, expertise, or anything about the clinical issues, but I certainly have values and preferences and desires about how I'd like to see that care go. The provider is the one that has the clinical expertise and the clinical knowledge to set out the options that he or she feels are appropriate under the circumstances. And I hope that providers don't think that when we're engaging in shared decision making that you can say, I don't really like the idea of not doing a C-section, but if that's what you want, and I'll explain all of the bad things that can happen, and if you still want it, then we'll go ahead and do it. I don't think that's the way it's supposed to work, and I would hope that the definition that we're all talking about has that in mind.
Definitely. And usually, obviously, the physicians are making their recommendations and about what's the best care for the patient.
Thank you guys very much. Thank you. Our panel here, please.